the planet will do okay eventually, millions of years, and with a different biological diversity composition. What is at risk really is the survival of one species that you know very well. It goes by the name Homo sapiens.
I'm joined today by Professor Rodolfo Dirzo. Professor Dirzo, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Absolutely my pleasure. Delighted to be with you this afternoon.
Likewise. This is, in a sense, the companion podcast to the podcast I did with Paul R. Ehrlich and Gerardo Ceballos for the book Before They Vanish, which you are the co-author of.
Yes.
So we're going to be getting into topics in the book and also related to your own individual research. So that's where I'd like to start. If you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Yes. So I come from a location in southern Mexico. It's the town of Cuernavaca, which is now a relatively large city. Beautiful because it's close to Mexico City, but not at the elevation of the city, which is 2,200 meters above sea level. This is a little bit in the lowlands, and it's very tropical. And it's interesting, Jesse, because when I was a young lad, when I was a young person there, there was still some interesting remnants of what is the beautiful seasonally dry tropical forest. That tropical ecosystem, which is not like the Amazon, but instead is a very, very seasonal environment. So, for example, in that area, or in many areas of what remains of seasonally dry tropical forest, you will have precipitation of about 800 millimeters per year, all of which will fall in a few months of the year, and the rest of the year is completely dry. And I was fascinated by this incredible perception of how the forest would look gray, almost lifeless. But then comes the rainy season and then exploded in leaves, fruits, insects, and so on and so forth. And I used to go out to those places and collect insects and enjoy and eat fruit. I mean, these forests have many plants which are dispersed by birds, and for that reason have very attractive and tasty fruits, a number of those. And I used to go to those, and I guess that created some kind of the dormant biophilia that we humans are supposed to have. That, in a sense, sort of brought that to my perception, to my appreciation. And then my parents wanted for me, I am the first person in my family who went to the university, to college. And they, of course, those years, you see, they wanted for me to be a respectable professional person, a white coat, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or something like that. And I was not really very attracted to that. But what I found more or less related, and potentially wearing a white coat, was to study biology in the local university in the state of Morelos, where the city of Cuernavaca is located. And so I went to the undergrad program in biology, which is good because at that time, biology was a very, or the sort of the training in biology was really very universal. I did zoology 1, zoology 2, zoology 3, zoology 4, botany 1, 2, 3, and 4, and evolution. I mean, really a very comprehensive training and capacity to understand the frameworks of biology. But because of the influence of my parent, I did very, very well in topics such as cell biology, physiology, biochemistry. And by the time I was ready to finish my undergrad, many of my teachers and mentors said, okay, you really want to be sort of a biomedical researcher person, a biomedicine research person. And I was almost ready to go to a hospital to work on enzyme dynamics. Can you imagine? But then in my last quarter, my last term, I had a professor of botany. And he actually was an evolutionary biologist, and he took me to the field. I mean, he took the class to the field, and yes, I just became fascinated to see that those things that I just loved when I was a kid actually had a structure, an organization, a framework that would allow you to understand why those plants produce fruits at a given time of the year, why have fleshy, attractive, colorful fruits. So all of that began to make sense in the context of the Darwinian theory of evolution and natural selection, and I became fascinated by that. That and the fact that I had this biophilia from my young years of being out in the field, and so that really defined me to be a biologist, and that was what defined sort of my fundamental training as a biologist
Mm.
to start with.
Amazing. And so your life progresses and the scale increases from cells and enzymes to plants. You end up studying in Wales with John Harper.
Right. But before I did that, Jesse, I had incredible pleasure of working as a technician, as a lab assistant, as a research assistant for a professor and a famous ecologist who also was trained in Wales. Jose Sarukan is the name, who was a former student of John Harper. And so I was in his lab for a couple of years after I graduated with for my undergrad from the University of Morelos, then went to UNAM with this professor, Sarukan, and then year two of my life with this lab, amazing training in ecology, demography, sort of looking at the population dynamics of plants, getting to calculate the numbers, mortality rates, fecundity rates, to calculate how populations grow and how they are controlled by factors, particularly at that time, factors of the physical or abiotic environment. Why is it that populations don't expand? Maybe because of frost in the winter season, those kinds of things. But then training with this man, Saru Khan, I became interested in understanding what other factors would be regulators of the populations or the dynamics of populations. And I thought of animals. And then I wrote to John Harper and I said, I am interested in your fantastic topic of plant population biology, but I'm interested in seeing to what extent this biotic element, not the typical climate or soil, those kinds of things, but the biotic elements of the environment actually play a role in the dynamics of plant populations. Yes, come. And so I went to do my master's and continued on for the PhD. And my thesis was actually on the evolution of plant defenses, Jesse, because very quickly I learned that animals are really an important aspect of the regulation of plants. And Darwin had done some beautiful experiments in his home in Down in southern England, describing how in his own home he noticed and did some experiments, for example, looking at how insects might control populations of plants. I remember very well a quote from chapter 3 of The Origin of Species. He said, "If we wish in imagination to give the plant the power of increasing in numbers, we should give it some advantage over the competitors and animals that prey on it." And that kind of a thing said, wow, this is so fascinating. And so I went ahead and did my master's and then PhD looking at things of that nature. But then the next question, the next obvious question is, why is it then the plants are not completely eliminated by animals? Because they cannot run. I mean, if they prey to animals, how is it if they cannot run away from the predators, from the herbivores? What is it? What's behind that? And then I became interested in secondary chemistry. Secondary chemistry refers to the chemical components of plants, which are not the typical primary compounds used, for example, in photosynthesis or for the Krebs cycle. Compounds that for many decades was not clear what was the function of those compounds. And some of them are really very peculiar, including the one that I studied, which is cyanogenesis, which is the capacity of some plants. Imagine this, the capacity of some plants to release HCN, hydrogen cyanide gas. And John and I discovered this plant that had been studied from the genetic point of view in the UK, the famous white clover, that plant that you see in lawns and gardens, that probably many people have stepped on it without paying any respect to this incredibly important and interesting plant. Well, that plant is polymorphic for cyanogenesis, meaning that in locations such as in Wales or in the UK, if you go to a given location, you can have a number of plants which are cyanogenic, but then the amazing thing is that some other plants are not cyanogenic. And so the question to me that was really exciting is, to what extent this capacity to release cyanide is a mechanism of the plants to be defended against herbivores? And the second most sort of exciting question to me is, what maintains that polymorphism? If the plants that have the capacity to release cyanide are defended, then I actually tested that hypothesis by doing a number of experiments and observations. And I did discover that indeed the plants that have produced cyanide are very well defended against slugs, snails, insects, and so on. But then the question is, the plants that are not defended, how come that in locations such as in Wales, you might have populations with 50% cyanogenic and 50% not cyanogenic? What are the evolutionary forces that maintain the polymorphisms in populations. Like in our case, right? The sickle cell anemia, we know what maintains what. Why is it that some populations in Africa still suffer that? And then why is it that populations that do not suffer that don't outcompete the other ones? And so that kind of a question became interesting to me. And so I did my master's and PhD thesis on the evolution of plant defenses, trying to understand, number one, to what extent animals represent a challenge, an environmental challenge for plants, and second, how plants respond to those challenges, meaning essentially secondary metabolites for the defense, including peculiar metabolites such as cyanogenic glucosides to release cyanide when an animal munches on the leaves of this plant. It's a very clever plant, yes. It has two compounds, so the plant doesn't want to be poisoned itself, right? So it maintains one compound in some sections of the leaves and the vacuoles, is a cyanogenic glucoside, and then an enzyme in other sections of the leaf. When an animal munches on the plant, it breaks those vacuoles, then the enzyme hydrolyzes the glycoside, and then that reaction releases hydrogen cyanide. So for these little animals, when they chew on the plants, they will feel the HCN, and it's really very clever because then the animals will tend to move away from the plant because they feel this nasty sensation of the HCN gas coming to their mouth parts. And so it's really beautiful because I discovered that if you wanted to predict by just looking at the amount of damage in a plant population, if you saw a predominance of just nibbling, little bites, and so on, so you might say, oh, maybe that's a cyanogenic plant because the animals actually try to, because I can tell if the plant is cyanogenic or not, right? So they have to give it a little bit of a bite. And indeed, that is the case. If you sample a population, you will see that the cyanogenic plants are going to be mostly intact or with little bits of nibbling. If the plants are going to be non-cyanogenic, they will have 50% of leaf area eaten, 70% of leaf area eaten. So that was the long story of my PhD thesis
Mm, mm,
in Wales.
that's amazing. Any chance you've read the book Semiosis by Sue Burke?
Yes, yes. I mean, all of those connections are really fascinating. But I guess, yes, you wanted to see what is the connection of that with moving to animals in the way that I am doing now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as you can see, sort of studying the role of animals in the ecology and evolution of plants already brought me into sort of the realm of the kingdom of the animals to see them in their interaction with plants. Went back to Mexico when I finished my PhD and went back to the National University where I was the technician of that professor that I mentioned before, Jose Sarucan. And I became a researcher there. And because I had been doing some work as a technician with this man, Jose Sarucan, I had done some work with him on the population dynamics of some trees in a tropical rainforest in Veracruz, Mexico. And I said, well, I have some experience in that tropical rainforest. Now that I know this question in this framework of evolution, coevolution in plants and animals, I want to apply those things in a tropical rainforest. And so I came back to Mexico really excited in the sense that I wanted to do the kinds of things that I learned in my PhD now in the tropics, because this is fascinating. Most of my work, yes, in Wales was with little plots about this big, with insects and slugs about this big that I could manipulate and do a bunch of very controlled experiments. I said, I'm going to challenge myself in a place where I should be looking not at slugs and snakes, but probably tapirs, deer, peccaries, those kinds of things. So I joined the university again, now as an assistant professor. And then I counted and measured thousands of plants and leaves, trying to understand what is the degree of herbivory, of damage on the plants by herbivorous animals. And very quickly, or maybe in year two of my research there, just I discovered that there was a lot of insect herbivory, but I was discovering zero damage by vertebrates. In a place where you should have deer, peccaries, a bunch of herbivorous animals eating the plants. And I mean, I had thousands of plants individually marked. I could follow them in great detail as I did in Wales, and zero, zero, zero. I said, wow, this is a little bit unusual. Unless this forest is so far in the north, this is Veracruz, far from the equator, unless this forest is not supposed to have that kind of interaction with vertebrates. So I went to the scientific collections in Mexico at the university, and I discovered that the pelts and the skulls and the skins and the scientific specimens of those vertebrates from that location had been collected by scientists telling me that these animals should be there and should be doing the kinds of things that I was expecting to measure and quantify. And they were not. And that sort of brought the idea, oh, maybe we're looking at this incredible, beautiful, luxurious, exuberant forest, which is empty. And then I began to think, well, maybe the patterns of herbivory that I am measuring in this place do not really represent what should be happening in a natural tropical rainforest. Kind of a long story, but then I decided to go explore other tropical rainforests similar to the one I had in Veracruz, but which I suspected would be very well conserved. And so my first research really on what I now call defaunation was comparing that place, the defaunated place in Veracruz, versus this other place, very well preserved in the state of Chiapas. And then I began to see, as my eyes were opened, because in Chiapas, the same kind of ecosystem, then I began to see that in general terms, about 20, 30% of the plants had actually evidence of being eaten by vertebrates, and zero, zero, zero values in Veracruz. As I say to my students, that was fun because I didn't even have to do the statistics because it was zero, 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 zero.
Mm.
But that to me was connecting me to understand a process that I'm very interested in. I would like for that concept or notion to be appreciated by people in general, which is that we talk about the extinction of species, the extinction of populations, but now seeing what I saw in this place of Veracruz, I am now talking just about the extinction of ecological processes at the local level. So the extinction of, of processes which involve interactions between organisms, in this case plants and animals. And so I was able to document in this place. That was my first big chapter on defaunation by describing the extinction of this ecological process in a location that is a field station of the university, is a research station. From the green point of view, from the sort of the botanical perspective, looks fantastic, but is what is now called famously place suffering the famous empty forest syndrome that
Mm.
Ken published in the early 1990s about places like this that look from the botanical perspective terrific, really very well, unless you do these kinds of crazy things that I did, like going out in the morning and staying late in the evening with my binoculars trying to see animals. Then I put at that time there were not the technology of infrared cameras was not available then, so I went out to collect sand and put it in randomly located positions in trails in the forest to detect the footprints of the animals. And then I was using that material that dentists use to make casts of your dentures. I had my piles of that powder, and then whenever I saw footprints, I would do my cast of those, and I began my collection of animals. And then again, I confirmed, Jesse, that the place that was well conserved, I was able, using that very primitive technology, I was able to detect peccaries, tapirs, deer, all kinds of things that I should be detecting. In the other place, again, zero, zero. Not only herbivory zero, but
Mm.
now prints also zero.
Mm.
And so that was my connection. Then the first paper that we published on describing the situation that I just mentioned to you actually used the term contemporary neotropical defaunation. And I wanted to use the term contemporary because by then, I mean, it was pretty obvious that we humans had an impact on the defaunation of the Pleistocene, right? I
Mm.
mean, the megafauna of North America and in many parts of the world that went extinct. There's still sort of an active controversy, but we do know that at least to some extent, we humans were responsible for the massive extinction of the megafauna of those times. So I wanted to use the contemporary neotropical because I was in neotropical forest. So contemporary neotropical deformation. So that was sort of the beginning of
Mm.
this new phase of my work that connects me from the evolution of plant defenses, herbivory zero, and then understanding that you might have a place that looks fantastic from the botanical point of view, but represent an anomalous situation, such as the empty forest syndrome
Mm.
thing.
And what year was that?
That was 1992.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, relatively soon after I finished my PhD with John Harper, um, maybe at some point we want to make the connection then to the last thing that I've been doing recently, which is how defaunation has relevance for things such as zoonotic diseases. But we
Yes.
can,
I definitely want to talk about that. I think before we do that, we need to spend a little time like more thoroughly defining defaunation and
yes,
how you're thinking about it relative to a concept like deforestation, which people are more familiar
yeah,
with.
yeah, that's a very good question, and that sort of brings me to begin the comment by talking about technology. Um, as from the mid 1970s, we have this fantastic technology that has been increasing in capacity and resolution, which is the satellite imagery, remote sensing technology, right? The satellites that are going around the planet, and I mean, now we have satellites that can have a resolution of 5 by 5 meters, an incredible resolution. Well, with that amazing technology, we can vividly and dramatically assess and see and show to the public the magnitude of the impact of human activities on the plant component of ecosystems. So, if you look, for example, to Madagascar, it will be a horrible situation if you see what was the force in Madagascar 20 years ago and what is now. And you show those images, and then people say, "Wow, this is an incredible impact that we're having on this aspect of biodiversity." Same thing if you go to the Atlantic forest in Brazil, or some areas of the Amazon and Mexico, and so on. And so, and the term and sort of the metric that is used to describe and actually quantify in a number what is happening, what you see in those amazing images, is the term deforestation, right? A term that everybody will understand. If you have a conversation, say, with somebody in your Uber, in your taxi cab, and you begin to have a conversation with this person, and the person asks you, what do you do in your life? And you say, I work and I measure deforestation. The person will understand. But if I say, well, I am using, footprints and casts to see what is the magnitude and changes in the abundance of deer and tapirs and peccaries or elephants and so on and so forth, it's going to take you this long for you to describe the phenomenon. So I said, well, the terms has to be. I mean, it would be nice if we had a term which is equivalent to deforestation and would convey the same notion, even though the technology would not allow it to see it at the moment. And because of that very reason, I decided that defaunation was a good term to use. Now, in terms of defining it, there are different metrics, yes. Yeah. And one that I always like to use is one that is not very good in terms of resolution, but is so revealing. There have been a number of investigators, particularly a researcher, who doing a number of amazing processing of data. Vaclav is the name of this person. In his book, he actually was able to quantify what was the biomass of wildlife in 10,000 years, 10,000 years ago in the Pleistocene, at the end of the Pleistocene, when all the megafauna had been eliminated. And he calculated about 300 million tons of animal biomass. What I'm saying is put all the animals of the planet in a mega scale and see how much that weighs, and it was about that amount of weight. Most of that, 99%, was wildlife biomass, and about a tiny fraction was human biomass. Move forward into, say, 1990s, and then you had about the same total biomass, but then you had another component. The human biomass increased relative to the previous recording, but then you had another element coming in, domesticated animals of us humans. And then you move on to today, basically, and that biomass of 300 million tons now is about 7 times more, and about 30% of that is human, and about 65%, or more than that, about almost 70%, is domestic biomass, meaning chicken, pigs, and so on and so forth. And all of that brings about that the wildlife that was almost the entire biomass 10,000 years ago is now about 1%. Yes. So that's one way of saying, okay, this represents defaunation, this process of defaunation. But biomass, although it's revealing in some sense, is not very good because it doesn't tell you what kinds of animals, what taxonomic groups, where, any of those kinds of things. So I engaged myself when I moved from UNAM to Stanford in trying to explore in more detail what are the general patterns of this phenomenon of defaunation. Basically, what is the magnitude of this thing? Where is this taking place? What are the drivers? Is that a sort of a random phenomenon, or does it occur particularly with some groups of animals, or is it just a sort of a homogeneous situation? And that was sort of the next phase. Now, when I moved to Stanford, I began to sort of move beyond that crude measurement of biomass into the details of defaunation.
Mm.
And so in my lab, we've been working and trying to document all of these details that I mentioned. What is the magnitude? Where is it happening? What kinds of animals are being impacted? And what are the drivers? At some point, all of that connects with zoonotic diseases, but we can leave that for later.
Well, just one thing to reflect back also is like, I think what feels so important about defaunation to me, who, I'm not an ecologist or biologist, is when I think of deforestation, my brain can conceptualize that as like the land, like I'm imagining satellite imagery of land being converted, like land use conversion from wild land to
Yeah,
farmland or urban land or whatever.
yeah,
But defaunation allows us to think about the process aspects of an ecology, where it's population extinctions, it's interactions across different populations that change as the numbers change. And I
yeah.
think that opens us up into that conversation about diseases.
Right, right. Yes, but perhaps a little bit of a connection of Veracruz and then defaunation and then diseases is the following. Yes, it has to do with the fact that defaunation is not a homogeneous phenomenon across animal life.
Mm.
And I think it's going to be clear to the persons who will listen to a conversation the fact that there is a very revealing factor, which is body size, that explains to a large extent what is sort of the pattern of deformation, in the sense that essentially we can see it through historical times and today. Say, for example, in the Pleistocene, the average body size of animals was, let's say, this big, so that we don't have to bring numbers here. Um, Occurs the deformation in the Pleistocene, and then the average body size of the remaining fauna is no longer this, is this. Why? Not because the animals that remain became smaller, because if you remove the big ones and you calculate the average body size, because most of the big animals went extinct, then the average weight is going to be like that. Okay. Now, if you go to today and separate what we still have in terms of vertebrates on the planet, separating those of large body size, meaning those of, say, 5 kilos or more in biomass, and less than 5 kilos, um, and you see what is the proportion of species that are classified as threatened in different categories versus not threatened. The mean body size of the threatened species is this, and the mean body size of the non threatened species is this. Meaning that body size is a good reflection of the susceptibility of animals to being impacted by the activities that we do. And there's a sort of an ecological and evolutionary explanation for that. Large animals require big areas to maintain viable populations. So look at the rates of deforestation, we're reducing their habitats. We're reducing the viability, the capacity of populations of animals to maintain viable populations there. Second component, most of those large animals, take the case of elephants, they have babies, one or two, separated in many years between one episode of birth and the next one. Uh, think of how many years it takes for them to become reproductive. All of those things that define that body size brings about a low population growth rate in the sense of the population of those animals. Now think about the small animals, for example, rodents. They can live in trashy places, and we are creating fantastic conditions for them to thrive, right? They have small body size, they don't require big areas. They are very generalist in terms of the food that they can eat. um, they have cohorts of, say, 10, 20 little mice in one single reproductive episode. And then the human component. We tend to hunt, which is another important driver of defaunation, animals that are large because they provide more meat or because they provide things such as ivory, in the case of elephants, or the pelts, in case of jaguars, and so on and so forth. We don't go around hunting small rodents. Uh, they offer no meat, they offer nothing in terms of reward. And at the same time, the life history, the evolutionary life history, is such that they can do very well in the areas that we have been impacting as a consequence of what we do today. And that leads me quickly to the drivers, which are land use change. That perhaps is the most impactful driver of the most prevalent factor or prominent factor of defaunation. Overexploitation is the second one. The third one is pollution of different types. Another one which is critical is the role of invasive species, non-native species that we deliberately or accidentally move to another place. And of course, I have to say, climate change. But the tricky thing here, yes, is that none of these factors operates in isolation. They are connected. So, for example, in my site of study in Veracruz, the deforestation that I measured, which was dramatic, and fragmentation of the forest, that reduced the viability of the populations. Perhaps many of them went extinct locally because of the reduction of habitat. But furthermore, once we created these levels of deforestation and fragmentation, then humans, it was much easier for humans to go into the sort of the inner parts of the forest because the fragmentation provides much easier access for them to do the hunting, which is the second element. So you have really a synergy of factors that create, sort of a set of ideal conditions for defaunation to occur. So body size and then human activities and habitat size combined to do those things. And then you have climate change, which of course is going to be impacting all of this. Is going to be interacting with all of these factors because as we do deforestation, more carbon emissions, less regulation of precipitation in a given location, more deforestation means less habitat for animals. And so you have now the combination of all of those factors coming together in a very complex synergy of drivers, of change, of biodiversity in general, and of animals in particular. And
Mm.
by the way, quick parenthesis here, yes, is that we scientists and the public in general tend to think about the drivers of global change as unique, independent things. So we tend to talk about climate change per se, land use change per se. We tend to talk about invasive species per se, but all of those things are combined. And so, from the scientific point of view, yes, it's going to be difficult for the scientific endeavor to model and to understand really the complexities of these interactions, let alone for the policymakers. That I mean, just with climate change, it's so difficult to convey the notion and get things to move to action, sort of close the knowledge to action gap when we are going to be talking about these complexities that are going to be dizzying policymakers and people like that is going to be a challenging thing going forward.
Mm.
Anyway, all of that is to say, what are the drivers of defaunation? And this component that is not homogeneous. Actually, the term that I use is differential defaunation. The big animals are the ones that are being impacted the most, and the small animals not only not being impacted, but we are actually favoring the ecological and evolutionary conditions for them to thrive. Unfortunately, in some sense, one of the most representative groups of animals in the small body size category happens to be the rodents, because there's a fundamental evolutionary reason here. If you have the mammalian class, which is all the mammals of the planet, and you divide that class into the different orders, so rodents, bats, ungulates, and so on and so forth, the number of species in the group, in the order rodents, is about this big. Many, many, many species, followed by Chiroptera, meaning bats, and then the rest have very few species. So statistically speaking, if animals carry diseases, pathogens, chances are that many of the animals that carry diseases are going to be rodents just because of the sheer number that they are very rich in species. Well, add to that the fact that we are favoring their abundance, and they're very rich in species, many of which are hosts of many pathogens. And here I am talking about, Leptospira, Leishmania, Borrelia, plague, as we know from those dramatic phenomena that occur in medieval times and continue to be present in many parts of the world.
Yeah.
Um, so we are, by this question of deforestation, you see, this is the incredible connection. By deforestation, land use change, and hunting, overexploitation, we're creating deforestation, but we are creating the differentiated deforestation, favoring the small animals. You remove the big guys and you remove the competitors, they remove the predators of the small guys. Change the habitat, and the trashy open habitat is good for the small rodents, but these guys carry many of the most prevalent diseases in diversity and in quantity as well.
Mm.
That's finally the connection of plant defenses all the way down to the risk of zoonotic diseases. Now,
Well, yeah, I mean, it all comes back to, in some sense, evolutionary fitness, and I know that Darwin was a big influence for you.
yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean, Darwin actually calculated if we were capable of allowing elephants to grow without restriction. I can't remember the details. I can't quote the details of this one, but he had calculated in how many years the entire land area of the planet will be covered by elephants. And that doesn't happen because of regulation and because of the fitness of other organisms and how this phenomenon, which I studied, population dynamics and population regulation, operates.
Mm.
But for animals that, we have helped them to eliminate many of the regulation factors, and the fitness is increased dramatically, right? I mean, and by the way, yes, I want to make absolutely sure that we transmit this idea clearly. I think we should not be blaming the rodents or the small animals themselves. They are not diabolic animals. What is happening is that we are creating the ideal conditions for them to do what natural selection has pushed them to do, which is a high fitness, high reproductive rates, capacity to invade multiple habitats, being very generous in their food habits, and so on and so forth. So this is not to say that we should go out and kill all the bats and kill all the rodents, because they also play ecological roles in nature, right?
Mm.
But obviously, when we destroy a rainforest and bats, the habitat is no longer present, and we destroy the rainforest for cattle ranching, and we have an infrastructure for the management of the cattle. Bats obviously are going to go to that human infrastructure, and then you have rabies and a bunch of other pathogens as well. And the combination is actually quite dramatic, because you have bats that the amount of cows that we might have, say, in a Brazilian cattle ranching area, or in Veracruz, with so many cows, bats are, finding ideal conditions there. But bats transmitted a bunch of pathogens, rabies amongst many others. And then the contact of humans with those cows that have acquired rabies, plus the bats now also accessing those locations where humans are. And so you have now this triangle of interactions that is driven by land use change, differentiated deformation, and then the risk of zoonotic diseases.
Well, and to say nothing of the fact, you've got antibiotic resistance increasing because of an overuse of
Yeah,
antibiotics. And so
yeah.
you have all these examples of these kind of mechanistic fixes or these mechanistic approaches when the ecologies are going to enact ecological responses that are going to elude us if we're not paying attention to
If
what's
we don't pay attention to these things, we suffered this incredible impact of the COVID just a few years ago. And I am fully aware that we are not allowed to say that unequivocally the reason for that, for the trigger of that pandemic to have occurred, was the Wuhan market. Some people argue that it was the laboratories in Wuhan. I think most of the evidence that seems more reasonable to me points to the situation in the market, because bats, pangolins, And by the way, yes, pangolins, for example, they carry alpha and beta coronaviruses, which is the same group of the viruses that impacted us with the COVID-19. The genome of those viruses that these animals carry, the pangolins, is about 90% similar to the genome of the virus that we were impacted by.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that close. So really, in some sense, I mean, to put it in a typical common expression, we're playing with fire there. Defaunation, actually, is all of these connections that we've mentioned, that we've talked about in this conversation, is actually playing with fire because these animals have those pathogens because of their natural ecology and evolution. I mean, we are not clear why is it that bats, for example, carry so many pathogens. We don't quite understand yet what is the reason, but those pathogens do not kill them, right? But those pathogens are just waiting for the evolutionary jump to find another host, which will not have the capacity of the bats to control those pathogens. Exactly what happened with the COVID. That pathogen, I mean, found an ideal host, Homo sapiens, and then see what happened, right?
Mm, mm,
And I mean, and as we sort of began to move, this pathogen was and is evolving continuously because the generation times are very short, and they can become resistant. They can do a bunch of things in a very short time. Well, all of those things are sort of the connections from human activities leading to deformation and the consequences in terms of human well-being. In this case, zoonotic risks.
mm.
Really,
Yeah, and you've been doing this field work in the African savannah. I'd love to invite you to share about that.
yes, i- yes, that's a very good question. Yes, because when I came from Mexico to Stanford, I already had these ideas because this is what I discovered by comparing those two forests that I mentioned, right? And then I knew that the deformation phenomenon that I had described in those papers actually brought about the increase in the abundance of rodents. This is something I have to declare to you and to anybody who's listening. Being a researcher in Mexico, most of my funding was to do research in Mexico, which makes sense, right? I mean, the national university wanted to use wanted to use the funding and the researchers to be focusing on problems of Mexico. But when I came to Stanford, that situation was much more flexible, and so I applied for a type of grant that Stanford provides, which is research that is kind of adventurous or even risky, that you don't know if it's going to work or not. And I wanted to connect the deformation, the differentiated deformation, and the rodentation that I call it, rodentation, with disease. And so I applied for one of those grants to go to, and where now I did not have the restriction of having to do it in Mexico. And I decided to go to Africa for two reasons. One, and the two of them are really sad reasons. One of them, Africa, is a dramatic hotspot of deformation. Just think about the elephant, I mean, sort of the ivory trade, the massive killing of elephants. I mean, that's just an incredible thing. So massive deformation, and not only elephants, large body size animals in general. That's one. The other one is that if you look at the maps of probabilities of emergence and re-emergence of infectious diseases, many of the hotspots are in Africa as well. So that just by looking at the literature and by knowing what I had studied on deformation globally, it was obvious for me to go to Africa. Then I connected with the natural history museums of Kenya, and so they were open to be my local collaborators in this research. And then also the fact that there is a fantastic research station in the Nanyuki district in north central Kenya, where there is a fantastic research station. It's called the Mpala Research Station, MPALA, and in that place, some colleagues of of University of California, Davis, had established these electrified exclosures, we call them, these fences to exclude some areas and prevent those areas to being visited or used by big fauna, by megafauna. The interest of these colleagues in UC Davis was to understand a very interesting thing, which is how do we how should we manage the cattle situation in places which are dedicated to pastoralism, right, to the movement and use of cattle there. And so they wanted to have areas with no cattle and with no elephants and so on and so forth. And then they would allow the cattle to come into those places and so on. And so I discovered that research, and then I joined forces with that group of researchers in UC Davis, and I basically asked the obvious question: can we use your electrified exclosures to simulate, to actually do the experiment of defaunation without killing any animals? And because they have the correct experimental design, they have the exclosures. They're large. They're 4 hectares in size, sort of the area of 4 football fields, so appropriate for the kind of animals that you want to exclude. And not only that, immediately adjacent to those exclosures, you have the control sites where all the animals can be present, doing the regular things. And not only that, that pair, the exposure and the control, replicated in space. Just like, microbiologists would do the studies in petri dishes with the 2 treatments in petri dishes, multiple petri dishes and so on, exactly the same kind of thing, an experiment at that spatial scale. And so then we organized a campaign to collect rodents inside the exclosures and outside the exclosures. And the fundamental aspect that is at the base of all of this work, Jesse, is the discovery, which took us about 2 years to come up with very clear numbers. If you lose the big animals in an African savanna, and this is done experimentally, um, you increase the abundance of small mammals by about 2.5 to 3 times more. So inside the exclosures, we had our Sherman traps, or mechanism of trapping rodents, which I will explain in a minute. Same thing outside. We caught about 2.5 to 3 times more rodents inside in the defaunated experimental manipulation than in the control. People might be wondering, how is that done? We have these special traps. They're called Sherman traps. It's like a little tunnel, metallic tunnel, which has 2 openings, one here and one here, and then you put bait inside. And when the animal bait for rodents or for small mammals, when they come in, the weight of the animal will close the 2 entrances, and then the animal is going to be trapped in there without being damaged at all. So you set those up in the evening, say today, and come back tomorrow morning early so that the animals will not be cooked by the temperature and so on. And then basically you just get your animals directly from there to your bag or to your lab. And then we did 2 things, or actually a number of things. First is we comb the animals with a special type of comb, the combs that people use in the past to get rid of lice and things like that that we used to have in those times in our head. We use that to get the ectoparasites, meaning fleas, all of those little ectoparasites that might be present in animals, eating, chewing or eating the blood of the rodents themselves, of the animals. And then we cut a little tiny piece of the tail, and then with the blood that comes out, we get a sample to see what are the pathogens that they carry, right? So we analyze the blood of the rodents or small mammals, and their ectoparasites as well. We also do a funny thing. We place an earring to each one of the animals, like a real earring, like a little thing here with a number. So we know which animal was caught when, in what treatment, what date, and in what condition, right? And then we release them. And then the samples of the blood and the ectoparasites, we connected with the CDCs, the Centers for Disease Control, because you cannot see what pathogens are in the blood, right? You need DNA analysis or
Mm.
molecular analysis. Luckily, the CDC has been in charge of doing that part of the research for us. So all the samples carefully defined as to where they come from, what animal, what species of rodent, in what location, goes to the CDC, and then they come up with a molecular identification of that. And from that, yes, the list of pathogens that they have provided us with is I mean, is fantastic in the sense of scientific discovery, but it's really scary. Um,
Mm.
Going from very abundant pathogens such as Bartonella to not very abundant ones, but not zero, like Yersinia pestis, Black Death, uh, bubonic pest. Not zero, not gigantic numbers, but not zero either. Now imagine the situation. A farmer goes to do his or her natural farming activities and comes into contact with one of these rodents. And then for some reason that person goes to a village. And then you as a visitor goes to that village, and then you get the pathogen there because of some contact. And then you fly back to Amsterdam or to San Francisco, and then you might have another pandemic right there. Anyway, so that's the description of the work in Kenya with these experimental manipulations, and that's really beautiful, Jesse, because it's such a controlled experiment. I mean, everything else is controlled. You have the exclusions with no animals, and the control sites in the same climate, soil, temperature. Everything is the same. So really, the difference that you find is because in one section you don't have the animals, and in the other section you do have the animals. So no, what we call it in experimental design, not experimental noise, not additional factors that might sort of confuse the result that you get. So that number that I gave you, 2.5 to 3 times more rodents, is really the result of not having the big animals, not any other microclimatic differences in temperature or soil, nothing of that kind. So it's really very unequivocal number.
Mm.
But then people who might be listening to us might say, well, but that is not a very realistic experiment, right? Because where in the world you find areas that are just that have just the big animals removed and the rest is maintained the same. Naturally, you will have, agriculture, pastoralism. You will have different kinds of activities by humans. And so, in addition to the experimental design, the experimental manipulations, we went ahead and looked for pairs of sites, but with the normal activities of land use in those areas. Imagine that you have a river here. One side of the river is a protected area, and then the other side of the river is where humans are doing their local activities. It could be, pastoralism for corn. It could be pastoralism. I'm sorry, pastoralism for cows. Could be pastoralism for camels, which is another thing that they do, or cattle, or agriculture. And so we have that more realistic comparison as well. And then, yes, as you could imagine, the situation is much more nuanced, much more complicated, because the number of rodents is not the same as we saw in the experimental, very controlled manipulation. The numbers of rodents change, but also the relative abundance of the different species of rodents. So some rodents are okay in areas that have agriculture, but some others do not. And then some species are more abundant in that condition, but not in the other condition. And then, in addition to that, not all the pathogens go to all the rodents. So the pathogens also have their uh, preference, so to speak, for particular rodents and so on. So you have a much more complicated situation because now you have a network of what rodents, what pathogens, what type of land use, right? And so we're doing now it's called network analysis to see how those things are connected. You basically put a matrix of rodent one, two, three, etc., and then disease one, two, three, etc. And then in another layer, you have the type of land use. And then you have what precipitation, what temperature, and so on to come to a more realistic and obviously much more complicated situation. And that is a work in progress at the moment. As I mentioned to you, we need to pay attention to the fact that it's not one factor, right? It's a combination of factors that come into play. That's what we're trying to do. And what I can tell you at the moment is that the predictions that we made for the very controlled condition are not completely applicable when you bring all of these elements. It's a much more nuanced situation. It depends on what pathogen, what rodent, what type of land use, what climatic conditions of the year, and so on and so forth.
Mm. Like when I think about this particular experiment, it's almost like having an understanding to the best of your ability of the, potential zoonotic diseases that exist in a given place,
Yeah,
but then also an understanding of how the local ecology works such that you can start to have maybe more fine-grained understandings of how these diseases might transmit, or if we're thinking about this from a practical human standpoint, like what are the scenarios we're trying to avoid from a farming or urban standpoint.
exactly. Sort of the development of scenarios, right? I have an interesting result in one of the papers that I want to share with you. One of the studies, and we had a selection of 5 diseases that are very prevalent there. but now not only comparing the control situation and the exclosures, but also in addition to that, looking at different types of land use. The interesting thing in that study, yes, is that we found that not all the rodents infected with these five diseases respond the same to the different kinds of land use type. And but the most fascinating thing to me, and this is really the first data set that we have on that, and I want to repeat it multiple times to be perfectly sure, but we discovered that in the areas that have pastoralism activities, remember that we're talking here about a community of people, the Masai Mara, who have the tradition of managing their cattle in ways that they will not overgraze, in ways that they will not sort of create a very nasty soil compaction so that the agricultural activities will be ruined. In the traditional cultural ecological knowledge as to how to manage their domestic animals, in this case cattle and camel, when we compare the situation, the control situation, with that kind of land use type, we found that these five diseases, only these five, not the many that we have studied, only these five diseases tend to be reduced almost statistically indistinguishable from the control situation where you have all the animals present. Implying to me, I mean, this is, we have not even put that in the papers because we really need to check it multiple times, but potentially implying that the traditional knowledge of the people in terms of managing their cattle, in cattle, I mean, actually, it's an animal that was domesticated right there, and the other animals that they use with the wisdom and knowledge from millennia might actually compensate for the absence of the megafauna, uh, given the way that they use the land for the. I mean, they're mostly vegetarian, but they use the cattle for the blood and the milk that they drink.
Mm.
Uh, so that opens another very interesting window of research. To what extent traditional ecological knowledge actually can be relevant for us scientists of the sort of modern approaches of science to understand from the traditional science that these people have about addressing some critical issues. That connects me with a thing that is not relevant for conversation today, but I just mentioned it as a sort of a possible point of reference. Now in Stanford, I am in charge of one of the units in the new School of Sustainability. It's called environmental justice, which is to what extent we pay attention to those communities that are contributing the least to these global changes, but at the same time are going to be impacted the most. And one of the elements that they contribute to society is the tremendous knowledge that they have about nature and what lessons we could learn by working together with them. Sorry about that parenthesis. That is not particularly relevant
No,
for our
no, it's extremely relevant. It's extremely relevant.
but I think it's very important for us to be aware of that. Yes, it might be very this point might be very obvious to people if we use the example of plant domestication. I mean, the reality is that we can eat maize, corn, we can drink coffee, we can drink chocolate, we can have vanilla, thanks to the activities of these traditional indigenous peoples that went through the whole process of transformation of wild, sometimes weedy species to the things that we eat today. Being a Mexican, I mean, the case of maize or corn, we do know unequivocally what is the ancestor of the maize. It's a bushy plant, it's a bushy grass called teosinte. It has an Aztec name, but we know the place where a community of indigenous peoples, the Zapotec indigenous peoples, we have the evidence as to how they transformed the tiny little seeds of the ancestor of the maize to the seeds that we eat today. And these local communities are doing experiments on a yearly basis. They're planting different types of different races of maize in different ecological conditions. And by now, Jesse, they have developed land races of maize, which are good for places where temperature is very, very high, where the rain is very low, meaning that given climate change and areas that we used to have for agricultural production, say of maize, no longer amenable for that, these guys already have the varieties that are going to be capable of growing in those conditions. Well, if we think about the things that we have now, thanks to the efforts of these people for the traditional trial and error experiments. I cannot imagine how many people died doing these trials until they discovered what kinds of plants, what kinds of pollens they should move to the other plant to have the progeny that they wanted. I mean, their experiments that went through millennia is what we're enjoying today. So it is very relevant, as you said, that this theme of environmental justice or injustice, we should be paying attention to that as well because we are very much in debt with these communities.
Mm. And you work directly with them.
I work directly with them. Yeah, I mean, not only in my research, but in terms of the teaching. For example, in Stanford, I teach a class. It's called Biocultural Diversity to convey this idea, yes, which is also very interesting. That just as we are concerned about the loss of biological diversity, there is another dramatic loss: the loss of the diversity of cultures. The culture of many of these communities is being eroded for many reasons. I mean, westernization in some sense, but also the lack of attention to these peoples and so on, or sometimes even the imposition or displacements, things that have happened historically in the U.S. and in other parts of the planet as well, right?
Mm.
Yeah,
And I know related to that, you've worked on essentially coevolution, like looking at the way
yeah.
human culture and ecological evolution have kind of played in tandem historically.
That actually became a very interesting topic to me because of the work that I did for my PhD research with the cyanogenesis. So the plant has to have these two compounds to be cyanogenic, right? The funny thing, yes, is that I went to the literature of the physiology of the slugs and snails that eat this plant, the main herbivores of this plant, and amazingly enough, that enzyme that is present in the vacuoles of the plant is also present in the digestive tract of the animals for their own metabolism and so on. So it's an enzyme that has multiple functions. And so my question was, if the plants, for the plants to be cyanogenic, they have to have the glucoside and the enzyme. But if some plants that do not have the enzyme, then they have only the glucoside. If the animal has the enzyme, the plant can be eaten because the gas will not come out to the mouth parts. But once the glucoside are inside the digestive tract of the animal should be suffering a lot, right? Because then the animal has the enzyme inside. And then I did experiments to rear my animals with plants that have only the glucoside but not the enzyme. And these animals do perfectly okay. So that tells me that the cyanogenesis that occurs inside their tummy, the digestive tract, was not affecting them, meaning that they had developed the capacity to deal with the cyanogenesis inside the digestive tract. And so the scenario is as follows. In the past, plants were being eaten by these animals. That became a selective pressure on the plants, and the plants evolved the glucoside. Then the glucoside and the enzyme of the animals must have created the cyanogenic reaction in the animals in their tummy. So that was an evolutionary response of the plants, an evolutionary response of the animals. But then the animals are in trouble because they have the cyanogenesis inside the digestive tract. So they must have evolved another step now to control the cyanogenesis reaction inside the tummy. And we know how that can be done, chemically speaking. So the animals invented that. So the animals are now again capable of being eating the plants. And so the plants are in trouble now. But then the plants evolve the capacity of having the two things on the same leaf, and then the animal is now not capable of eating the plant. So you see those coevolutionary changes. The animal is selective pressure on the plant responds, but then the plant becomes selective pressure on the animal, and the animal has to respond to it. And so that's the beautiful coevolutionary steps that we see in nature in many, many examples, including the evolution of resistance to pathogens and so on. But then the connection of that with my recent work is kind of the opposite, the coextinction phenomenon.
Mm.
Because I mean, the typical example that people who are listening to us might relate to is the famous case of the dodo, right? The dodo went extinct in Mauritius, and then the gizzard of this animal had such design that some particular fruits that the animals ate when those seeds and fruits went through the digestive tract, the gizzard will produce the phenomenon of scarification, remove all the factors that prevent the seed from germinating. And when the animals either regurgitate or poop, the seeds were ready to germinate. And now the extinction of the dodo brings about the extinction of the plant that depended on the dodo for its dispersal. So the plant is no longer being sort of dispersing its fruits, right? Or the same situation, those megabirds in New Zealand and in Australia, the moas, birds of about the the height of myself. Um, when humans went there and killed all of those mega birds, the moths and so on, the eagles that used to be the predators of those animals went extinct as well because of this phenomenon. Now we call it coextinction. So one extinction brings about a cascade of consequences leading to the coextinction of species. So, I mean, this beautiful phenomenon of coevolution, now we're sort of going against it by propagating or facilitating these processes of coextinction.
Mm.
There's a beautiful example from Brazil, from the Atlantic forest, in which you can almost see evolution in action. There is a very common plant that is used by local people. It goes by the common name of palmito. This is the palm heart that we eat in salads, which is really wonderful. Well, that palmito has seeds about this big, fruits about this big, which are dispersed by big birds in the Atlantic forest, toucans and big birds like that. With the defaunation, particularly the big birds or the big animals or the bird dispersal agents, the palmito is not being dispersed. But now these colleagues of mine, they have discovered that the palmito has gone in the direction of reducing the seed size so that the birds that are becoming abundant because of the selective differentiated defaunation can be the dispersers because they have the size of the beak that is capable of not capable of handling the big fruits, but capable of handling the small fruits. And now the palmito is going in the direction of reducing its average fruit size. So you see this phenomenon of coevolution being disrupted, moving sort of interaction in another dimension to co-evolve now in the direction of the palmito tree, changing the characteristics of its fruit to accommodate the birds that remain now and have become the important dispersal agents of this plant.
Mm.
That's, I mean, so it's kind of the application of the concepts of coevolution now for these kinds of things that we're provoking or seeing happening.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like one, among Homo sapiens is great abilities. It seems like one of our great abilities at the moment, at least. But even stretching back to the Pleistocene is inducing co-extinctions, like inducing trophic cascades.
Yeah, yeah. The case of the African situation, the cascade is as follows. We eliminate elephants and giraffes and zebras and so on. That changes the conditions of the savannah, basically in the following sense. If you don't have the elephants and giraffes and those big animals, the typical acacia trees, emblematic of the savannas, which produce the pods that the elephants and giraffes eat and then disperse and help the tree to be dispersed, in the absence of these animals, they're no longer being dispersed, and all of the seeds and fruits fall to the ground. So we remove the animals, and then there's an overproduction of seeds on the ground for animals who might be interested in eating those rodents. Um, in addition to that, in the absence of the big animals, the shrubs and the grasses become much more abundant, and so the rodents are now protected from the avian predators, right? So they are doing great because they're reducing their predation. For the mesopredators, jackals and things like that, with such a density of the shrubs and grasses, they cannot hunt as well the small prey. Another cascade there. So the rodents tend to increase. If the rodents increase, their ectoparasites increase as well. If the rodents increase and the ectoparasites increase, the pathogens that they bring also increase. So you see the cascade going from this anthropogenic impact going to the primary producers, going to the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, eventually to Homo sapiens with these risks of zoonotic diseases.
Mm.
It's kind of a domino effect that you see provoked by one element being removed, right?
Yeah. What do you say to folks who would hear something like that and say, well, you know what? Like, that's the way it goes. That's evolution. Like, give the world to the rodents. And, we like, why even bother trying to change?
I would say that there's much to be preoccupied about, but there's much to be occupied about as well. One thing, because of this lesson that I mentioned to you of the traditional knowledge, we need to support those indigenous peoples. one thing that's really critical in that regard, connected to that, yes, is that a great proportion of what remains of biodiversity on the planet is on indigenous lands.
Mm,
So we want to aspire to have biodiversity, at least at the level that we have today. We need to be paying attention to those communities there. And in addition to that, as we mentioned, these guys, for example, in terms of carbon emissions, they contribute the least or contribute zero, and they're going to be impacted the most, right? The financial situation, economic situation is not going to find them prepared for that. So paying attention to those asymmetries in society is really critical. Um,
mm,
the over exploitation, the second most important driver of defaunation. Jesse, I ask myself, why is it that we as a society in the 21st century need to buy ivory? Why do we need to maintain the ivory trade as such a big illegal and big industry there? We could survive with that. And now you see, it's so wonderful. Some people, some communities, even in China, they are using bones of cattle to do the same artwork that used to be done with ivory. I mean, if I go to a market and I'm fascinated by those pieces of artwork, if I want to buy that, I will go for the cattle artwork and not for the ivory. Locally, there's a famous basketball player of China. I've forgotten his name. He has been a sort of a champion, bringing these connections to the local people, and people are reducing the purchasing of ivory artwork. Um, if you go to some indigenous communities, they're doing sustainable forest management. For timber production. They cut the forest in very narrow bands, and all the trees that are colonizers immediately go to those narrow bands, and they don't come back to those narrow bands that they had cut now until 4 years later. They've calculated how long you need to leave the place to rest, and they go to another place, and then you have a very dynamic system of sustainable forestry. I mean, so we see a lot of examples that provide hope. The case of these marine turtles that come to given locations in many coastlines around the world, very much declining because of the consumption of eggs or the turtles themselves. Well, some communities in Central America, heavily impacted countries by wars and by economic unsustainability, things like that. Some locations are actually bringing the turtles back to the level that used to have before. So there's a number of examples that provide hope and evidence that things can be done. More broadly speaking, I mean, I think uh, uh, we should really organize ourselves in a campaign to stop land use change, in the sense that we're doing now, destroying the habitats of the species, because that's a dramatic driver. We should be able to stop overexploitation. And those are things that I mean, with campaigns of education and things like that, we should be able to do those things without much suffering. There's another one that might be a little bit trickier, which is the overconsumption of meat by society today. I can assure you, I mean, and don't take my word, there's so much evidence about it. Major rates of deforestation is because of cattle ranching, extensive cattle ranching, carbon emissions, deforestation, methane emissions, and human health because of that. Uh, and then again, there's incentives for cattle ranching to continue prosperous in many parts of the world, when we should be, you know, uh, providing incentives for other kinds of more sustainable, diversified agriculture, for example, um,
mm.
reducing the consumption of meat. I'm not saying that tomorrow everybody should become vegetarian. I am vegetarian, by the way, but I mean, reducing a little bit might actually begin to help us in that direction. And what you're doing right now, Jesse, spreading the word, because I mean, my responsibility as a scientist, as a professor here, is to publish the papers, find the rigorous mechanisms of understanding these connections. But that's not enough. I need for people to see what is happening, and I'm not capable, nor I do how to do it. I don't have access to spread the word. So what you do really, and sort of your industry or your profession, is so important for us. If you spread the word, if this is disseminated, protection of areas, natural protected areas. It's about 15% that officially is protected. I mean, we should be able to include more areas for protection. And as I said, many of those belong to indigenous communities or rural peoples. Well, if we want to have those areas protected, then we should do something about those communities, compensate or have help them to have a dignified life and so on. Beyond all of this, what you guys do is I feel hopeful because that can lead me to aspire to an educated society that will demand at the moment of elections policymakers that will make a commitment to biodiversity, to global change, and those kinds of things. Um, and all of these phenomena brought together, I think, gives me a lot of hope. This is a sort of a macroscopic evolutionary thing that I want to share with you. Over the last 550 million years of life on this planet, in a time called the Phanerozoic, which is the last 550 million years of evolution of the planet, we have seen five major extinctions, right? Five. The last one, is the sexiest one of all, is the extinction of the dinosaurs, and everybody is fascinated by that. That was the crash of this meteorite with the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago. Now, in all of those five episodes, and particularly this last one, Jesse, we see that life has been able to come back. And now, I mean, some paleontologists argue that after this last fifth extinction, the diversification of the planet is the maximum that we might have had in the 4 billion years of evolution of the planet. What is the message of that? That biodiversity, that life is capable of coming back. But two important buts. One, it takes millions of years. And I'm not planning to live multiple millions of years to see that everything is going to be back. And second is a biodiversity qualitative aspect. What comes back is not the same that you had. So on average, 10 million years, you might have the same level of diversity for some groups of organisms. But for example, in 66 million years ago, the dominant life on the planet in animals was the dinosaurs. Now is the mammals and the birds. So what will come back is going to be a very different setup of biological diversity, and we have seen that in all the five years. That's we know for sure, and we have five mega experiments that have demonstrated that's the situation. What
Mm,
that means, and here's the sad part, is that really the planet will do okay eventually, millions of years, and with a different biological diversity composition. What is at risk, really, is the survival of one species that you know very well. It goes by the name Homo sapiens. So, really, the existential problem is ours, and it will be very sad, to think that I am not helping for my ancestors, for my descendants. Sorry, to get to know this planet. I mean, it's such a sad situation.
yeah.
But yes, I mean, many of my friends say, "Don't say that, Rodolfo. That's a horrible thing that you say." But I feel that in my position, yes, we have the responsibility as to use the English expression to tell it like it is. Right? I think it's essential to get to know what is the magnitude of the issue, but also to get to know that there's things that can be done, and there are beautiful examples of. I mean, the wolves in Yellowstone. I mean, they sort of restructured the complicated food chain that was completely destroyed now. So we can do things, but we need to do it quick. I mean,
Yeah.
the speed at which these global environmental changes are occurring, particularly climate and loss of biodiversity, is really, really fast.
Yeah. I so appreciate all of that, and I'm definitely leaving in the hard stuff to hear. Just I mean, because I agree with you. I think in order for us to act, I think it's important that as many people as possible understand essentially how bad it could get. Like we're in this moment where we're in something like the precursor to the sixth. Like Peter
Right.
Brandon makes this point that if we were actually fully in the sixth extinction, it would be beyond our ability to do anything about. But
Yeah.
we're in this kind of precursor phase to the sixth extinction where everything's happening very rapidly.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of mirror processes to what happened in the end Permian,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
other
Right.
extinction events, and we can intervene. And
Yeah.
so I think there's this culture of like having to be optimistic all the time and having to be hopeful, which don't get me wrong, optimism and hope are good.
Yeah,
But I also think there's been a sugarcoating of like how bad it could get, how quickly, and biodiversity is at the center of that. Like one thing reading, I'm going to hold it up again just because I really want people to go buy this book.
yeah,
One thing reading Before They Vanish that really stands out to me is like obviously climate change and carbon emissions are
critical.
so
Yeah.
critical that we address them, but it's almost like in the manner of sort of charismatic animals, like pandas or something. It's almost like there's charismatic issues, and carbon emissions and climate change are kind of the charismatic problems. But then something like biodiversity loss, I feel like it's way less ink and way less people talking about it.
Ah.
And I almost wonder like if that's an inversion of what's more important on a rapid timescale. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, yeah, precisely what you said. I mean, you know, perhaps the fact that climate is felt so vividly by people immediately, as we say in that book, really the best representation of the sixth mass extinction is not the extinction of a species. Yes, I mean, say 400 species that have gone extinct, or vertebrates, in since year 1500 to now. Even in my community, in my scientific community, say, well, 375 species, 400, I mean, in these many years is not too bad. But that's not the case. The situation is the prelude of that, which is the extinction of the populations. And if you have a business, say for example, if you manage to set up a tourist attraction place that is your income, say in a place in Kenya, for you as a person living in that area, you don't really care if the elephants are still present in South Africa, right? For you, your business, your situation there is as if the elephants were extinct. And for the processes, sort of this disease cascade that I described for you, I mean, for the local people who might be infected by all of these pathogens, they don't really care if the rhinos and giraffes are present in Zambia or Mozambique. I mean, for them, the problem is right there. So, for the functioning of ecosystems in your locality, in your location, it is not really so relevant that species is not in the catalog of even endangered species or let alone extinct. The prelude to extinction from the face of the earth is this relentless phenomenon of population vanishing, as we describe in the book. Trying also, to convey this idea that just because you don't see it in the temperatures of today, but it's behind us at this relentless pace. And then there's this other thing that it is so simple and at the same time difficult to for people to absorb. The reality is that we drink biodiversity, we eat biodiversity, we breathe biodiversity. I mean, essentially, biodiversity is the life support systems that we have on this planet. Is the center of that is what biodiversity does for, I mean, for all species, including this one, right? So I mean, we need to do whatever we can to bring biodiversity to the fore for people to appreciate that of the many global environmental changes that we're dealing with, five or six, the most dramatic ones, biodiversity might be the most important because that one is irreversible.
Mm.
Unless you do what I want, what I said, you're prepared to live 10 million years and prepared to see a very different planet in 10 million years from now. I mean, that is not a realistic situation, right? So really, what is at stake is quite significant, actually.
Mm. Well, I mean, yeah, you just said it so well. Just to add something from the book, you describe it. Biodiversity is our wealth. That is like truly our wealth.
It does truly our wealth. I think Paul and Gerardo are putting together some analysis as to where is the wealth of the planet, talking precisely, I mean, changing the concept of wealth in the very direction that you're saying right now.
Mm. Mm. Oof, a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we
Um,
have work to do. But I mean, what you guys do in your profession, I mean, it's so critical because I mean, my papers in scientific journals, that's fine, uh, but, but we need to sort of penetrate more into the imagination of society, in the perception of society. I, by the way, yes, I think a lot about the younger generations, and
mm,
in addition to this research that I have described for you, my history in terms of as a researcher and my work as a professor in Stanford, I try to do as much as possible of educate outreach, I call it. Going to communities. This area, which is a fantastic area of the U.S., the Bay Area, there are so dramatic asymmetries in the social condition of people. So I do programs. One of the programs is STEM for Latina Girls. I bring girls of Latin origin to Stanford to appreciate what is science, why is it relevant, what is the beauty of science, and so on. Just to provide opportunities for them, because I really think that, many of the ambassadors to address this issue and collectively think about it are going to be the generations that are not my generation, but the generation that is coming behind us, including the youth now.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing that you do that work in your free time, as it were.
In my free time, yes. Yeah.
Speaking of your free time, you've been so incredibly generous with your time to talk to me today. I have three questions that I like to close out every interview with. If you like, some of these questions might touch on things we've already talked about, so feel free to bring those back in or to reiterate them or take it a totally different direction.
Yeah. The beauty and significance of biodiversity. And I said that because I didn't think of an appropriate moment to bring it. In addition to the typical services that we think of when we talk about biodiversity or ecosystem services, the food, fiber, those materials, and so on. There is also a cultural service, an emotional and psychological service. Locally, yes, you might have seen there's a bunch of papers now indicating to what extent human well-being, emotional, sociological well-being, and cultural well-being is provided by biodiversity. So one of the things that I wish very much is that people will have an opportunity, everybody have an opportunity to appreciate and see the beauty and the value of biodiversity for society. So that would be an incredible dream if we were able to convey this and provide this opportunity to everybody.
Mm, mm. What is one resource that you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
The kinds of things that you do. The broad communication. I mean, you and all the media, right? That I mean, TV has a capacity of penetration to society, which is an incredible thing. I mean, if those media were actually dedicated to allocate significant amount of effort to convey all of these things that we've been talking about, I think that would help us to two things. One is to enjoy and appreciate the beauty of our planet. Yes, this planet took 4 billion years of evolution to come to what we have today. I mean, isn't that an incredible thing that we evolved at the same time with the maximum richness of the planet is when we happen to be present here? That's an incredible cosmic gift. We should not be pushing that incredible trajectory in the other direction.
Mm,
If we were to convey, I mean, in some more meaningful, engaging way, all of these things, that would be fantastic. And the other component is if we, with this kind of appreciation, were to become a society that demands from the policymakers that they pay attention. I mean, rather than paying attention to climate in some cases, but if they would pay attention to the situation of biodiversity, that would be a tremendous thing. And that could have an impact in relative. I think I heard Barack Obama sometime in one of the COPs of climate saying what we need to do to address these issues is obviously support the other nations that are not contributing as much and being impacted the most, but also to have policy makers that understand, appreciate the magnitude of what is at stake, and we need to demand from those candidates and policymakers to to help us do the job. And the other thing is that I would love for us to appreciate the fact that this is not a question for scientists only. This is not a question for communicators only. This is the moment in which we need to collectively be connected. Even in the educational component, yes. I mean, we have now a School of Sustainability in Stanford. One of the motivations being is that we scientists alone will not be able to address these problems. We need to break those silos. I mean, the ecology department will not talk to the animal ecology, to the plant ecology. No, we need to break those. But now, not only within one discipline, but across disciplines, the social and human dimensions into the problems of the science of global change is absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential to have all of these disciplines. We need to change the way we educate in our universities, in our schools, and we need to educate the way we need to educate the public in terms of the massive communication that we do, like what you do on TV and radios do as well.
Mm, mm. Interdisciplinarity is yeah,
It's a key word. It's a key word,
keyword.
actually.
Keyword. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
yeah.
And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Perhaps when I went for the first time to the Amazon and I flew over the areas that had been heavily impacted by cattle ranching, and then I went over the area of Manaus, which is the physical center of the Amazon. Actually, going from Sao Paulo, in the flight to get to this place and this physical center of Amazon is multiple hours, but what you see for a great proportion of the time in terms of the massive destruction, and then you come and see this incredible beauty of the forest that still remains, but then seeing what remains being so much impacted. And perhaps if I could sort of condense that in a moment, yes, I want to share this experience with you. 10 days ago, I brought to Stanford. I was so lucky to have a connection with a leader of the Amazon, an indigenous person. His name is Joani, Roani. This person was discovered by a president of Belgium many decades ago, but then he was discovered by the singer of the Police, Sting. And they went around, so they became friends, and they went around the planet, mostly in Europe, actually. And they managed to raise funds to protect, I can't remember how many millions of hectares of the Amazon. Well, he came to Stanford. He doesn't speak Portuguese or Spanish or English. He spoke Kayapo, but his grandson, Bep Took, came with him. He translated in Portuguese for us and then for the audience. And Jesse, the message that he brought in terms of the expressions, even if you could not understand, the mannerism, the motivation. He's 93 years old, and then the translation into Portuguese. And he began in the middle of this conversation. This is Stanford, right? I mean, most of the faculty tend to bring, the chiefs of state and people like that. I brought this man. I could see people crying. He, in the middle of his conversation, began to sing a poem about this big tree of the Amazon. It's an imaginary tree being our father and how we are the different branches and how cutting the branches is eventually killing the tree, passing a message of beauty and appreciation and of the beauty of the planet, not only by the West, but on the beauty of the cultures and the people that has created this incredible resilience to be in all of these parts of the planet and are managing to survive there. Those are moments that are so significant to me, so impactful. And then to think that these people are, dealing with very difficult challenges, invasions and massive conversion for cattle ranching, massive conversion for soy production, for the soy to go to other countries where we will feed the pigs for people to eat meat. That combination of elements with one person that represents all of that, those are the incredible moments that I cherish so much and I appreciate so much.
Mm. Is there anything that came up while we were talking sort of in the back of your mind, or stuff that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Not really. I think I actually covered as much as possible, but I want to insist on the significance of the massive communication and appreciation of the work of the significance of communication to the public in general. That is a tremendous help for us scientists.
Well, I'm here to help. I don't know how much I can't speak for other folks in the media, but I'm trying to spread the word, because your work is so critical.
But maybe some other communicators will be inspired by what you do and motivated by what you do. Younger communicators and so on. As we said, this is a collective activity that we need to engage on.
Amazing. Well, Rodolfo, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest in this.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.